So today we have the great opportunity to hear from Luke Peterson, somebody whose work I've admired from afar when he was at UVU and then at the Salt Lake Tribune, and now he is the executive director of the Utah Lake Authority. He's going to say more about all of these things, and I think this should be of great interest. So we'll turn the time over to Luke. And we have is it cheesecake? Cheesecake bars at the end. So don't leave without grabbing a few. I think we've got plenty. All right, Luke.
All right. It's good to be here, and I'm excited about this opportunity to talk with you all. I tried to come up with a stupidly provocative title for my remarks tonight, and I hope this works. I titled it this way because what I want to talk about is really just how I think about the future and how we fit into the future. And this applies to both you personally, but then how you impact society, how you have a greater impact beyond yourself. I've had a really weird career, as you're about to see, that has taken me all over the place physically and psychologically and emotionally, and you name it. And there are some through lines to it, but it's also just sort of very weird, like myself. I've patterned my presentation tonight. I probably thought too much about it, but I patterned it off of my favorite documentary, which is called The Fog of War. It's an interview with the former Secretary of Defense, Robert S. McNamara. And the subtitle of that documentary is 11 Lessons from the Life of Robert S. McNamara. Now, when he's interviewed for this, he's like 99 years old, so I don't have 11. But I've got several that I'm going to try and sort of use to frame my remarks. And if we don't get through, I think I've got 8 or 9. If we don't get through all of them before it's question time, I will summarize. But just wanted to give you a little sense of where we're headed. So the first lesson I want to talk about is embracing your roots. And I'm going to start way from the beginning here, because I think it matters. So I am from the beautiful town of Payson, Utah. Perhaps you've heard of it. This is me as a little tiny kid. I am old. That's what this photo tells me whenever I look at it. Like the weird sepia tone, and I go, what was I born in the 1880s? I'm not sure what to make of this particular photo. But I grew up, this is when we lived in Benjamin, so rural outside of the city of Payson. And then when I was about 5, we moved to the city of Payson, moved to a very old house. The guy in the foreground here is my brother Eric, who's an investigative reporter. In the background there is my dad, Bob Peterson. And if Eric or any of my other siblings were here, they could testify to the fact that my dad was a very unique human being. It was kind of like being the child of a wizard or like mad desert prophet. And there's so many stories to illustrate this. I'll give just a couple. So one time he thought it might be a good idea to liberate dogs from the animal shelter. So he went and adopted all of the dogs. So we're talking 30 dogs. And then he just took them in truckloads to our house out in rural South Utah County. And then we just had a lot of dogs for a while. And then they just sort of scattered or died in terrible accidents or, whatever. But we had liberated those dogs. Another example, so I was born in 1980. And so I have my childhood memories come from the 80s, and 80s and 90s. And my dad would write on dollar bills. He would write "Impeach Reagan." He was not a big Ronald Reagan fan. He would write "Impeach Reagan" on them, and then be too afraid to spend them. So he just had like a stack of impeach Reagan $1 bills that just stayed there until really after Reagan left the presidency. So he was a really interesting, unique human being. This is a photo. He's the little kid in the back row. This is a photo of all of the polio survivors in Payson from the year 1951. So when my dad was about 5 years old, he had polio. And polio is a really interesting disease. As you can see, some people are wheelchair bound by it. Obviously, people die from it. He spent about a year in an iron lung, and then he never regained the function of one of his lungs, and he had mobility issues for the rest of his life. And post-polio syndrome is really weird. So for the rest of his life, he was extremely sensitive to temperature. He was only comfortable if it was like above 98 degrees-ish, right? And he was always tired. So he would drink about 2 pots of coffee in the morning in order to be awake, and then he had to take a minimum 2-hour nap in the middle of the day, and then after the nap, another 2 to 3 pots of coffee in order to be awake till bedtime, right? So this is how I knew him my entire life. Now, of course, this creates problems. He had a lot of difficulty holding down steady work. He was a sheet metal worker. So this is my mom, so my mom wound up being the primary breadwinner, and she spent a lot of time working. And when I say a lot of time, I remember like all of my memories growing up are my mom would wake up at something like 4 a.m. and she had a workshop. She was a florist, and she made crafts and ran her own business. And she would go and work from 4 a.m. until like 10, 11 at night, every single day, 7 days a week. So she was incredibly hardworking, just trying to like keep our family going. And she made a lot of crazy sacrifices. There was a point where we were just out of money, and she literally had to sell her bed in order to keep the lights on for another month. Things would get tight, and she would make ketchup soup, which is what it sounds like. And so we did a lot to just sort of survive through that time period. So when I say embrace your roots, like, I'm really proud of my parents and the heritage I get from them. But I'm talking about embracing both the good and the bad. So when I talk about good and bad, and I added this because my mom would, of course, prefer to a photo of her yard, because that's what she is most proud of. So I included that right there. So when I say embrace your roots, I mean like embrace your roots, right? So I'm from Payson. And what's Payson famous for? Not a lot other than the 1985 movie Footloose, okay, which we are obsessed with in Payson. This is our legacy. If you haven't watched the original Kevin Bacon movie, it takes place in the fictional town of Basin. All right, they got really clever. And it features things that I have always thought sort of define Payson. It involves playing chicken with tractors, okay, doing whatever this is, okay, which, by the way, people did all the time when I was in high school. They would get on this exact same road and do this kind of idiocy, and I was just like, all right, I don't know how any of us survived to adulthood, but here we are. And this sort of thing, fishing for carp with pitchforks, like that was a thing for us as well, right? So we're Hicks, in other words, right? It's a redneck paradise down in Payson, but a lot of that defines like how I see the world and how I feel about the world and how I think about public service. And when I talk about embracing these things, right, as we go on through this, I think you'll see kind of how that comes into play later. This is where I went to elementary school. This is Barnett Elementary. This is another good example of embracing the good with the bad. I had some really terrific teachers at Barnett, but I'm going to talk about the bad ones. In kindergarten, so I had a lot of trouble reading, And I'm what today is called neurodivergent. So I'm both, I both have ADHD and autism. And back in the 80s, though, they didn't call it that, especially in Payson, Utah, right? They had other less kind names for it. And so I had a lot of trouble reading. This was one of the problems I faced in the beginning. And so like my kindergarten teacher told my mom in front of me, she's like, Luke is slow and he will always be slow. And then when I got to first grade, my first grade teacher was like really big on phonics. Phonics was like the thing at that time. Hooked on Phonics worked for me, except it didn't work for me. And it didn't make any sense. It didn't compute in my brain. And his solution to this, because it just seemed impossible for me to be this bad at reading and writing, was that he would come behind me and whip the chair out from underneath me so that I would spill on the floor, right? And so yeah, Payson in the 80s. And the most interesting thing about this to me is that I don't remember it. So I only know about it because of friends who were in the same class with me who tell me about it, because I actually don't have memory of basically anything before high school. I have like one clearish memory for each grade, because part of just being a neurodivergent kid in this situation is my brain blocked out a lot of stuff. And I say this not to say like this is what defines me, or any of these pieces really defined who I am, but really to say like we all go through things. I don't know what your experiences are, what challenges you've had, but for me, all of my strength that I've had in my career, in my life, has come through these situations, both good and bad. They allowed me to grow. So I include this. This is basically my memory of school up to high school. Lesson number 2: shore up your weaknesses. This is a critical one. So when we're talking about neurodivergence, I don't know if you've ever seen this TED Talk by Tim Urban. I hate this TED Talk. I know, my wife loves it. Now, why does my wife love it? I think non-divergent people love it because it's Tim Urban basically going and saying, like, I don't know if he knew he had ADHD at the time, but basically describing ADHD, telling why it's awful, and then not really posing any solutions, but allowing the audience to mock him in the process, right? And I get this, people send this thing to me all the time. They're like, this is you. I'm like, thank you, I know. I didn't really need a reminder. But the whole concept of it is like, how do we wrestle with this problem of procrastination and so forth? And, and he's basically describing ADHD in a lot of detail. But the idea that you have to like fight your nature is kind of a weird one to me, right? Like, it reminds me of this Far Side cartoon, which I don't know if you can read this in the back, but this sheep is declaring to the rest of the flock, wait, listen to me, we don't have to just be sheep, right? Or to be just sheep. And I think that like this is true, right? Like this is kind of how I feel about people struggling with neurodivergence is you have a lot of tools in there too. I think Temple Grandin has said that she'll have young kids with autism come to her and say, I want to be an advocate for autism, autistic individuals. And she says, that's great, but probably the best way to be an advocate is just to be really good at something while still being who you are, right? And so that's kind of what I want to emphasize in here is like you can work through things without succumbing to them or being defined by them. So one of the ways that I worked through a lot of my issues was through debate in high school. This angry-looking individual here in the center, that's me. It's, I think, valuable or helpful to note that I was an atheist from about the time I was age 5. I'm not exactly sure why, but I just was in sort of like a very angry mindset. And that, again, not a good fit for Payson in the 80s and 90s. But debate was this great place where I was able to like work through all these things and overcome a lot of my challenges. And I debated a lot. I went to every single debate tournament for every year of high school and lost every single round, like through that whole time period. I was terrible at debate. But that wasn't the point. The point for me was, by this point in my life, I knew I wanted to work in public service. I knew I wanted to affect change. And I knew that in order to do that, I had to be at least passable at getting in front of people and talking through an issue with them, making an argument. So I just forced myself to do it. And by my very last debate tournament, which was I think like the SUU Invitational or something, I took second place in my event, right? And that's literally the only time I placed in debate, was that very last tournament. But it's consistent with the sort of the 80-20 rule. And the way that I think about this 80-20 rule basically being that when you're working on something, to get about 80% of the result, that takes about 20% of the work. But the last 20% takes about 80% of the effort. And this is true if you think about it, right? Any complex thing that you take on follows this sort of power law distribution with regard to effort and results. And so you shouldn't spend all your time working on your weaknesses by any means, but spending some time, and I would say since you're young, front loading, like this is a great time to work on it. High school was a great time for me to work on it. College is a great time to work on, those things that otherwise might derail your career. This is a great time to sort of put in the energy. You're not going to become the best, most likely, in that thing that you are weak at, but you will hopefully make some progress. Okay, lesson number 3, the universe respects action. And this, I believe to my core, and I would, you can say, fill in the blank here. The universe or God respects action. But the basic idea here is that when you start to move, when you start to put your life in motion, opportunities will open up. And so when I graduated from high school, I was really depressed. I was struggling with depression in general. All of my friends left on missions, right? And I was kind of left the last person my age in town, it felt like. And I was just struggling with all that. And then both my dad's parents died within 3 weeks, all in this time period. It was really rough. And I was sort of staring into the abyss, and it was staring back into me. And I remember I went with my dad to go clean out my grandparents' house, and this is the first time I would not have described it this way at the time, but I felt a spiritual impression. Something pushed me in the direction of the bookshelf that was in the corner in the living room. I went over to the bookshelf, and I picked up the Bible that was there, my grandma's Bible, and I opened it up, and it was here, which she had underlined. If any of you lack wisdom, let him ask of God, that giveth to all men liberally, and upbraideth not, and it shall be given him. But let him ask in faith, nothing wavering, for he that wavereth is like a wave of the sea, driven with the wind and tossed. Now, you all know why she had underlined this verse, but I didn't, right? I had no LDS context. Despite the fact, again, that I grew up in Payson in the 80s and 90s, and everybody I knew, for the most part, was a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, I knew next to nothing about the church. I knew that they didn't drink. I knew that they didn't smoke. The basics, but I didn't know anything about the Book of Mormon, really Joseph Smith. I knew that he was called a prophet. I didn't know what that meant. I knew that they had prophets, right? But this for me was my trigger, just the same way it was for Joseph Smith. This was underlined. Now here's the other part of this. There was also a stack of cash right there in the Bible, okay? Now, this was the part that was weird to me as an avowed atheist, was that there was cash in there that was exactly the amount that I owed for tuition at UVU, that I was trying to figure out how to pay so that I could go to college. And she had put the exact amount. Now, of course, my dad saw this. He's like, "Oh, that's mine." But we, had a brief, furious fight, and I kept the money. But I felt like I had entered into sort of a possible contract with my grandmother, and so I was like, all right, I'm going to start reading this Bible. And I found that I actually liked it and I enjoyed it, and it sort of set me in a particular direction that changed my life. I wound up kind of in this process as I was trying to sort of awaken. I thought, well, I have a lot of opinions about the school system that I was, kicked out of and that I can't remember most of. So maybe I should run for school board. And so I filed to run for school board in 2000 when I was 19. And that happens a lot today. It didn't back then. I was the first really young candidate for office in Utah, and it was a good experience, right? I mean, I survived the primary election. I was defeated in the general election. My ideas were kind of, now I look at them and go, wow, I was kind of an idiot. But the process was very valuable, and again, it kept from one thing to another, life started to move in a certain direction. As a result of running for office, I wound up working for a congressional campaign. As a result of working for a congressional campaign, I wound up as a research assistant for the Center for the Study of Ethics at UVU, where I found my people, and that sort of became my academic home. And all my mentors were there. I ultimately wound up joining the church and serving a mission. It's me on the left, in the Rome, Italy mission. And these are my paisani. That's my trainer right next to me, Elder Maki. And it was a great, as you can see here, sweaty experience, right? It was very hot all the time, but it changed me, right? It's through this whole process of these few years, I sort of changed from a DNA level up. And the things that my dad had sort of taught me about, the importance of making an impact on the world, really sort of crystallized. And for the first time in my life, I actually felt like I could do it, like I could have an impact on the world that would be significant. I also met my lovely wife, who's in back, as a result of all this, so that's good stuff, and so forth, okay? So lesson number 4 is decorate your Christmas tree. And this is where we get to the critical pieces of this. So when I got back from my mission, one of my professors, Elaine Engelhardt, one of these mentor professors that I worked for, she was in charge of the big prestigious scholarships for UVU, and she said, Luke, you need to apply to the Truman Scholarship, which probably some of you have applied to or are planning to apply to. I knew nothing about it, but I was like, okay, sounds interesting. And the scholarship itself turned into a roadmap for me. I kind of felt like, okay, I see what it takes to get this, and I kind of wanted to do this sort of thing anyway, so now I'm just going to dive in, right, with all my energy into sort of just doing things, right? I wanted to affect change, and so I started looking at, for a long time I had been trying to ask myself, what is the best thing I could do to have the broadest impact? And the answer that I came up with, right or wrong, you decide if you want. The answer that I came up with was campaign finance reform. I wanted to reduce the influence of money in politics. So I started a nonprofit called Utah Students for Clean Elections, which sadly I no longer have a logo for, so I can't even show it. But we became affiliated with a larger national organization called Democracy Matters that works on the same issues. I wound up on the board of Common Cause for the state of Utah, which is another big national nonprofit that works on campaign finance reform issues, and so on and so forth from there. And eventually I had a day, I had a day where the other professor that I worked with, David Keller, great guy, environmental ethicist, and David came in. David had this loud, booming voice, and he came in and he said, Luke, Jenny Wilson has asked me to be on this Salt Lake County Ethics Reform Task Force, and it's a bunch of philosophy professors, and we don't know what the hell we're doing. Would you come and help me figure out what we're doing? And because this is like what I ate, slept, and breathed, I was like, sure, yes, I would love to. Please let me do that. And David turned out to be right. It was philosophy professors, and philosophy professors are great, but they didn't really know anything about this particular subject. They were like still trying to define like ethics when I showed up. And I was like, I think a lot of this work has already been done. And this is where I implemented a sort of an Edmund Muskie concept. Edmund Muskie was the senator from Maine who was the architect of like Clean Air and Clean Water Act and a lot of other major pieces of legislation. But Muskie had this approach, which was basically he would let all the other senators come in, give their introductory remarks, right? The stuff that would go in the record, pose for the cameras, etc. And then they'd wander off to go talk to lobbyists, or go to a different committee or whatever else. And he would just basically wait until everybody else was gone and then write the legislation himself. And it worked. It was just like he was more committed to the actual crafting of the legislation. And that's kind of how this worked. At a certain point, I can't remember where in the process, but after a while, it was just me and Jenny Wilson. She's now the Salt Lake County mayor, but at the time she was just on the Salt Lake County Council. It was just the two of us at these meetings. And between the two of us, we wrote all of the ethics laws for Salt Lake County. The only real campaign finance law that's ever existed in the state of Utah was adopted by the county at that time. And this is, I love these Deseret News headlines. Deseret News, I don't know why they hated me at this time. And every time I would do something, they would come up with these terrible headlines. But we were looking at public financing of Salt Lake County elections, and I won't go into. If you got questions, I can answer what that is exactly. But it was a little bit of a revolutionary proposal. But Jenny pushed it forward, and Jim Bradley, who was also on the council, backed us up, and it ultimately was defeated. But at the end of the day, I was a 24-year-old kid who had written a significant amount of policy that affected a county with 1 million people in it, and that was pretty good, right? Like I felt pretty good about myself at that point. And it all kind of, things felt like they were fitting into my master plan. Now my master plan was super complicated. I'm gonna walk through it. I was gonna finish my bachelor's at UVU in history, and then I was gonna get a law degree, a super plus one, that's what the plus sign is for, so like a really good law degree. And then I was going to save democracy, okay? Now, this, I am not joking. In my head, this is how it worked. I knew that there was probably something that had to happen right in here, right? But as far as I was concerned, the logic held, right? And I didn't look too closely at it. And I think that was really beneficial. What I would say is like, this is a great time to find something you're passionate about, hammer it, become an expert in it as best you can. See if you can find an opportunity to make some serious change about it. And later on, you can figure out whether or not you were right. Okay? Because ultimately, life is more complicated than this. There's a lot that goes between get the law degree and save democracy. And ultimately, I didn't wind up getting a law degree. So here we are. Now, what does this have to do with Christmas trees? So this is the metaphor that I would always use with my students when I've taught at UVU, was that you are decorating a Christmas tree right now, okay? And so it could be a Christmas tree that is like the kind that we generally do at the Peterson household, which is just like a bunch of junk that we've accumulated over the years, stuff the kids have made, good, bad, ugly, pretty. Kind of throw it up, toss some lights on, really, a wimpy little tree that is not going to impress anybody. Or, the people who have the big windows and who get the really big Christmas trees and really commit, right? Like, these people know what they're doing. There's a theme to this tree, right? They went with, I think, red, gold, white, when I look at this one. And most, like, trees, if you ever drive around at Christmas time and, like, stop and go, ooh, that's a nice Christmas tree, they have really put some thought into it, okay? Now, what I had unknowingly done, trying to pursue the Truman Scholarship, which again I didn't get, was sort of decorate a really beautiful Christmas tree. So that later, when I applied to grad school, people looked at it and they go, wow, we've got to admit this guy. And this is always, I mean, this is it. I assume a lot of you are poli-sci majors. I'll tell you the exact same thing I used to tell my poli-sci majors, which is, by itself, that degree is not worth a whole lot, okay? That is the sad truth. Just like my history degree, they shut down all the history factories in the 50s. That's a joke, there aren't history factories. They shut down all the poli-sci factories in the 60s, right? Like, this is something that by itself is not that appealing. Now, to a grad school, it can indicate, like, they look at a liberal arts degree or a social science degree and say, this is someone who's learned, hopefully, critical thinking, right? The most critical, important skill. But what they want to see is that there's some proof that that's actually true. And so your GPA fills in some of that blank. And if you're applying to law school, your LSAT score fills in some of the blank. Or if you're applying to grad school, your GRE score fills in some of that blank. But they also want to see that you actually did something that shows that you care about something, that you're committed to something that forms a coherent Christmas tree that makes them go, ooh, I like that Christmas tree. I'm glad I stopped at that window today. Okay, so this leads us to lesson number 5, work with time, not against it. I like to think of time like a lazy river, if you've ever been at one of these at like an aquatic center. The idea is that it's just like a circuit of water that moves really slowly and you can just sort of drift in it. This is how I think about time, okay? Today, whether you did anything or not, the day will end after 24 hours. The same thing will happen tomorrow and the day after that and the day after that. So you can literally just sort of hang out in the lazy river and drift for the rest of your mortal existence. That is an option because time is going to let you do it. No matter what you do with each 24 hours, it's just going to keep moving. Eventually, they're going to turn off the park and you'll be dead. But in the meantime, right, the question is like, what are we doing with our time? Am I like using the flow of things to power what I want to do? And so what happened with the Salt Lake County Council was similar to Kingdon's idea of a policy window. Basically, you have to be in the right place, doing the right stuff at the right time in order to affect change. And I was doing that, right? I was running this campaign finance reform group. Nobody cared about it. It was pointless. It really seemed pointless. We would do editorials, we would hold press conferences, we'd complain about something the governor was doing. But then there was an ethics scandal in Salt Lake County, and suddenly everybody was like, who on earth knows anything about election reform and government ethics and so forth? And so you affect change by just sort of always being ready. And so developing that expertise can really help you. And I was starting to see the cracks in my plan of law school, and I had a friend, Doug Spencer, who's now a law professor at the University of Colorado, and he said, Luke, you're really more of a public policy guy. Have you thought about applying to some public policy programs? And I said, no, right? Because I'd just been thinking about law school since I was like 12. And he said, just apply to a couple. And so I applied to 2. I applied to Brown University and Harvard University. And in case it wasn't clear earlier, I am a first-generation college graduate. I was the first person in my family to graduate from college. I applied to these schools on the assumption I would not get in because they were scary names far away in the East. And then I got my admission notice to Brown, and I was like, what do I do now? And then I got my admission notice to Harvard, to the Harvard Kennedy School, and had a stroke, right, Amanda? I mean, effectively, I had a stroke, right? It was like half my face. Anyway, something happened neurologically that was not healthy, but I was excited slash terrified, and then I was like, oh my gosh, I forgot to apply. I hadn't applied for a financial aid. I was like, because I was so convinced I wouldn't get in. And then I get this note a couple weeks later saying, due to your, exemplary commitment to public service, we're awarding you the Presidential Scholarship, which was, they covered all my tuition and gave me a stipend. And I was like, okay, I guess I'm going, right? Like, I didn't know what to do, and I couldn't really figure out how I got here. But it was really like that Truman Scholarship that I didn't get, that impetus that it gave me to just go out and start doing and fire all of my energy in a particular area, trying to make a particular type of change happen. That's what they saw, and that's what they fell in love with. And when I came to UVU and I ran my center there, this was what I tried to do, was build a center that would systematically help students to do what I did by accident, really. And it worked. I'm no longer run it, but I'm very proud of our track record. Every student who went through my office, worked through our program, went to a top 10 graduate program in business or law or public administration, whatever they were going after. They all wound up at Harvard or Columbia or someplace like that. And so it's like, this is a simple truth that you need to take action. You need to move. You need to show the universe that you have life. And that works for the universe as well as admissions committees, right? They're both looking for that sort of like depth of commitment. That's what they want in a candidate, okay? Now, at the same time, lesson number 6, don't confuse motion with progress, okay? So I don't know if you've ever seen the design squiggle before, but I've worked most of my career in the innovation realm, trying to work on innovation in government in particular. And the design squiggle is the idea of how you get to innovation, right? You start out in a very messy place, using empathy to try and understand the nature of a problem, trying to understand how it affects people. You go from there to sort of defining, coming up with ideas for how you might solve the problem, prototyping, testing, and eventually you get to implement something. This is how innovation works when it's true innovation. When it works well, this is what it looks like. So I live, as an ADHD person, I live over in that end of the squiggle, right? My brain is just constantly all over the place. And it is terrible when I'm trying to find my keys, okay? But it's great when I'm trying to help somebody solve a public policy problem. And so this is kind of to circle back to my original point of just, eventually I learned, and I wasn't until I was in my 30s that I was diagnosed with ADHD or autism. But I learned that this stuff, right, what was going on in my head, besides making me lose my keys, was also like this really powerful tool for helping to come up with solutions, right? And so I began to move from motion, from just like frenetic, my brain all over the place, to kind of finding a way to channel it and to create positive futures. Okay, so as an innovation guy, I do a lot of work in futurism or future studies. And this is the model that I like to use. I was really flattered when they adapted it to add that preferable circle. That I told them to, I was like, I want to do this, and so they added it. But this is the futures cone. This is the idea of like how we think about the future if you're future oriented, if you're trying to solve problems. So you stand at now, and you have a lot of possible futures that fan out in front of you. Some of them are preposterous, right? Some of them are plausible or projected, right? That's probably where we're gonna wind up. But that doesn't mean that they're preferable. The most important question is, where do we want to be, right? Where do we want democracy to be? Where do we want the health of our ecosystems to be? Where do we want our economy to be 25, 30, 40 years from now? We're going to time travel from now to there. Again, one way or another, each day down the lazy river, we can float or we can take active action. If we float, we're just going to wind up wherever the water takes us. If we want to get somewhere, if we want to actually achieve something, we have to know what it is and get good at anticipating the sort of moves we're going to have to make in order to steer ourselves and whatever it is we're trying to change in that direction. And that's really what I've tried to do with the rest of my career. In the process of that, I've acquired weird degrees. So I have a bachelor's from UVU, master's in public policy from Harvard, probably, as of this semester, a master's in English literature from here at BYU. I did a fellowship for the European University Institute, and then in January, I'm starting a PhD in London. I can't tell you that all of them made perfect sense, okay? I really can't. But I can tell you that they've all been useful, and that I was just sort of following a combination of looking ahead, instinct, and just after a time, looking into the future becomes more and more intuitive. And if you have ADHD, you do this all day. Your brain just works through different calculations. What if I did this? What if this happened? What if this happened? And so it's a helpful strength. Now, if you're not neurodivergent, I would say this is something to shore up, right? Like, get to where you have that sort of strategic outlook that allows you to see further into the future and sort of anticipate things. I'm starting this PhD at the University of London. I feel really confident that it's the right thing to do at this time. I can't tell you exactly why, but I'm pretty confident that down the road it's going to be the thing that I need to have done for some reason at age 45. Okay. And then, so next piece, lesson number 7, steer into the storm. This is an idea. So if you're on a boat, this is, I think, a destroyer, and you get hit with a tsunami, you don't try and run away from it. You have to literally turn into it, right? You have to cut through the waves. That's your only hope, is to just cut through these oncoming, terrifying waves. And that principle is, I think, so profound, because we live in a time of constant tsunami, right? Economic, political, social tsunami. There are a lot of challenges out there. And one of the problems that I suffered with at Harvard was that within 2 weeks of arriving at Harvard, I no longer felt confident that campaign finance reform was the thing for me. 2 weeks after that, I just wasn't even sure if I was confident of anything anymore, like, is the sky blue sort of a thing. Like, I went through a lot of transformation, and it was largely due to the fact of I had to stop dealing with the fact that I was just going to go from that arrow and save democracy, and I had to figure out, like, okay, Luke, you're probably not actually going to save democracy. So what can you do, right? Like, what is the scale of impact that you can have? And the answer most often, or always, I have found, is that you have to just kind of go, what are you afraid of? What sounds the most terrifying? And steer into that and see what you can do. This is from a card. Do you remember giving me this card, Amanda? I think this one I graduated. So, like, this, I feel, captures a lot of how I felt in that time period transitioning. My first job out of grad school, I went and worked for the town of West Warwick, Rhode Island. It looks pretty nice from this photo. That is a deception. It is a rough town, and especially at that time. So this was 2000. I graduated in 2008, so just in time for the big recession, hooray. And I was just trying to find a job. And I had a couple of good job offers that paid decently here in Utah. But then there was this opportunity in Rhode Island. And I remembered that at the Kennedy School, all the most terrifying case studies all took place in Rhode Island. I was like, could it really be that scary? I want to go find out. So I like took this job that paid like $20,000 less than the next lowest offer, and we moved to Rhode Island, to this town. And at this point, so unemployment in West Warwick at this time was 25%, so like Great Depression level. It was a really hard hit town. It's full of old textile mills, and I soon discovered that Rhode Island has some interesting facets to it, most especially organized crime. So this is the old head of the Patriarcha crime family that ruled Rhode Island. This is Buddy Cianci, who's one of my favorite characters of all time, if he were a cartoon instead of a real human being. As a real human being, he's a little bit terrifying. He was the mayor of Providence, Rhode Island, twice, separate times, because both of his administrations ended when he had to go serve federal time, right? So, like, he was, and they kept electing him, and he was gonna run one last time, and then he died, I think. But I think he would have been reelected a third time as mayor. He served a total of 21 years as mayor of Providence, though. So Rhode Island was a town that was, or Rhode Island, yeah, we might as well call it a town. It's a really small state. Rhode Island is a place where, like, organized crime, corruption, very real, very much alive to this day. And I ran headlong into that particular tsunami wave. So I was hired as an assistant city manager. I was given the job to keep the town from going bankrupt, which was really hard to do because the town was about to go bankrupt, and it was in a lot of debt. And there weren't a lot of options. We had 3 different unions, and each contract for each union was about 3 inches thick. You couldn't fire somebody. We had employees who had not shown up to work for over 2 years who we could not fire because of how, like, you had to write first written warning, first verbal warning, first meeting with their union rep, like just the timeline, just to get through it all and all the things that you had to do and the timeline you had to do it, it took a minimum of 2.5 years to fire somebody. And we had to save this town from going bankrupt. So it was a really tricky situation. Jim Thomas, who was a member of the church, who was the town manager and one of the biggest characters in the world, he loved it, and I found a kindred spirit in him. What, Amanda? Time? When do we run out of time? Right now? Right now? 1 minute. Okay. All right. I'll go really fast for 1 minute. Anyway, he had this idea of, like, we just have to go and do everything we can. So we threw a lot at it. We dealt with the flood. I left after helping the town to save itself financially. It was tricky, and it wound up running me afoul of the mafia, and then I had to move to Utah. So then a lot of stuff about 5D chess in here. I'm going to go through this really quickly. This is the rest of my career. I worked in Heber Valley. Matt Holland then recruited me to work at UVU. I started the Office of New Urban Mechanics, which was a partnership between us and the City of Boston and the City of Philadelphia's innovation offices. We worked on government innovation. We threw flowers. This is not going to make sense. I became an editor of the Salt Lake Tribune. I ran their innovation lab, so solutions journalism, and I got to report on really nifty things, and a lot of it related to agriculture, the environment, and then ultimately landed at the Utah Lake Authority. And it is the greatest job in the world, okay? Just for the record. For me, as the guy who lives in the messy part of the squiggle, nothing is better than Utah Lake. Because what I love is a messy problem that anybody else looks at and goes, I want to run away in terror. That's where I'm happiest, right? Because that's where I can have the biggest impact. So I love my work, and it's been a delight to talk with you. Happy to answer any post-class questions, I guess. Thanks.
least one question.
Sounds good.
Two questions.
Yes.
When's Utah Lake gonna be safe to swim in?
Safe. So we had a bad harmful algal bloom this summer. Probably the worst one we've had in several years. That was a natural reaction to the fact that we got a lot of nutrients going into it. And also, it was an extremely hot, dry summer. That's the perfect storm for a bad harmful algal bloom. You don't want to swim in it right now. It's cold, but when spring comes, it'll be fine. So HABs tend to form latter end of the summer, right? Like July, thereon. Sometimes they're bad. Sometimes they're really bad. Usually they're fairly localized. So if you get past the marinas and out into the water, you should be okay. But every once in a while, we have a really bad one like we had this year. So it was unfortunate, but it does happen, and it is a really common consequence of climate change. Hypereutrophication is every single body of water in Utah has harmful algal blooms, not just Utah Lake. We just happen to be the poster child for them for some reason. But every single body, every reservoir, every lake, every pond, they all get harmful algal blooms. Some shallow lakes like Utah Lake get them worse. And so, but every state has a lake that has at least one really serious harmful algal bloom lake. And it's something we have to work on. It takes time, but generally speaking, every single spring, you're good to go swim because you won't have a HAB in the early part of the season. Otherwise, look for notifications because it's probably safe most of the time. You just have to go onto the DWQ website and see where they have a HAB advisory at that time. Is that helpful? Okay, good. Yes?
Like your spiritual journey paralleled and influenced your overall life progression and your career?
Yeah, so, the simple way to put it is I count everything good in my life from that moment that I went and picked up that Bible. Like, it just sort of changed the whole trajectory, not only of how, not just spiritual, but just kind of the way that I see the world in general. All of it changed from that moment forward. I became hopeful. I became convinced that, I could have some sort of impact. And that's all I've ever really wanted out of life. Ask my parents, right? Going back to when I was a little kid, I just wanted to do something. In high school, I tried to start a soup kitchen in Peterson. It didn't work out, but, and eventually we got a food pantry that way. But, it just made it so that I felt like I could do those things. And I definitely have moments of feeling overwhelmed, but in general, I feel the opposite. When faced with a big challenge, I just feel excited. I'm just really happy that I get to dive into something like Utah Lake and see how I can improve it.
All right, thank you.
Thanks, everybody.